Welcome to Fairness in Financial Markets, Dance and Dialogue. And this evening is particularly unique because even though you may have noted in your programs that we performed this piece, or Margie did, in New York, this is the first time that composer and musicians and dancer have been together in the performance, so we're quite excited about it. It's a one and only thing, I think. My name is Janice Sarah, and I am the director of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia, and I'm also a professor of law. The performance is part of a collaborative research project aimed at developing a deeper understanding of and a broader public policy discussion about sort of the market, policy, and other considerations arising out of the global financial crisis. The booklet that you receive sets the stage for that discussion, and you'll see it has a lot more information than most booklets that you receive at things like this. And the idea is it's your takeaway to go back and hopefully generate some discussion among your own peers. The global financial crisis and its aftermath have left individuals and countries around the world devastated financially and economically. The causes of the crisis are highly complex. Banks were undercapitalized, financial institutions securitized their loans, which meant that they bundled hundreds of mortgages and other loans into derivatives called collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs, and they sold them to ordinary retail investors as safe investments when in fact they were high risk. In turn, the shedding of their own risk, because they bundled and sold them on, meant that they stopped the kind of screening and monitoring that usually occurs with banks that sort of underpins some of the security of our financial system. Derivatives traders received large bonuses based on deals that created incentives for them to pursue short-term profits to the detriment of long-term financial sustainability. The proliferation of credit default swaps, designed originally to manage risk, created a highly speculative market. And if I can just stop for a second and say, so credit default swaps people talk about them as a form of insurance, but they're not really. Unlike insurance, if you insure your home, you're actually not allowed to insure your home for more than the value of the home, and in most cases, not even the value of your home. There's a reason for that. You'd have an incentive to burn it down and take the money and maybe build a better home. Credit default swaps, though, you can actually purchase a credit default swap, and you can run a bet on a company, and that's what was happening. And so people were buying CDS on multiples of the value of a company, and then they were precipitating its failure. This is exactly how Lehman Brothers failed, which started the cascade of failures. And so there's no limits, and there's no law anywhere in the world that limits that kind of speculative market. So unlike home insurance, the incentives, of course, are to do this and then to cause businesses to fail. Our research in this project on fairness draws on many disciplines to understand the causes of the financial crisis. For example, cognitive neuroscience helps explain why financiers cared so little about the harms that they created, and it also helps to explain why all of us feel such a visceral, physical reaction to the unfairness that has been generated by the fallout. The brain actually registers fairness and unfairness, so if you thought it was all social conditioning, in fact, there have been a lot of very solid scientific studies that talk about the amygdala and other parts of the brain that register fairness. And there's one study by Fair and Smith that found that basically fairness outcomes or fairness offers make people happy, even where it's independent of their material utilities. So in other words, if something's unfair, there's a negative reaction or contempt for it, even though there might be utility for that particular individual. And I think that helps. The other thing that found was, in fact, a very small amount of unfairness can have ripple effects in society. And so one can think about those studies of the brain and think about how a small group of derivatives traders in New York and London, with a culture that was really short-termism and disregarding of others' perspectives, actually caused a cascading effect in a global market. At its heart, fairness is the capacity to take the perspective of another and to adjust our conduct and our decisions towards, I think, more equitable outcomes. And we could spend a whole evening talking about the definition of fairness, but that's the one I think I've settled on for the time being. Fairness as perspective taking actually dates back hundreds of years, Rousseau and Kant, etc. And we know from Kant, for example, that there's no precise answer for moral behavior, and that individuals must continually use judgment, and judgment is guided by continual imaging or imagining of the impact of a rule or a norm on other individuals. Political scientist Mark Warren suggests that the moral capacities humans need to make judgments about fairness are already inscribed into basic social competencies. Fairness engages us in our individual relations, movement between us and among us, but so too fairness is important at the institutional and societal level, a dance between ourselves and powerful institutions that can support or harm us. The global financial crisis and its aftermath, of course, have highlighted great unfairness. Homes foreclosed on. There were more than 500 foreclosures in the United States last year alone, so the ripple effects continue. Pensions vanishing, banks collapsing, and savings wiped out. More than $3 trillion in savings were wiped out in the first year, life savings of people. And investments lost because of complex financial products that were represented as safe, but which devastated individuals financially. Now, while Canada didn't have a subprime meltdown that we heard so much about with our cross-border news that happened in the United States, we did have a meltdown of a $32 billion asset-backed commercial paper market. And that left more than 2,000 retirees without their life savings until the government intervened to broker a deal. And even though they had restitution, there were hundreds of small municipalities, school boards, and small businesses that lost between $1 and $5 million each. With the decline in pension plans in Canada, the defined benefit plans, everybody here, will at some point use financial markets, either to invest directly their funds or through mutual funds or investments that are done through a defined contribution plan. Yet the markets are designed for investors who can afford to lose money. They're not designed for individual economic security. So there's a fundamental disconnect between the way we've designed the markets and how we're using them now. Financial advisors in Canada, unlike a number of other jurisdictions, do not have to act in your best interest. So this is a big shock, right? When you go and get some financial advice, the standard is know your client, suitability. If I'm a financial advisor and I have 3 products and I can make a lot of profit on one, as long as it's suitable for you, I don't have to advise you in your best interests. Now, lawyers have to act in people's best interests, professors, doctors. We all have to act in the best interest of the people we're serving, so why not financial advisors? Financial markets are important drivers of unfairness. Complex derivatives, expensive credit card debt, some of the credit card, there's been a study to say that some of the credit card debt, particularly of seniors and immigrants and young people in Canada, is at the sort of 35–45% mark for credit cards now. So we all think that 21% is pretty awful. Securitized loans work to disadvantage ordinary people while earning millions for a select few who have been disregarding ordinary people and other perspectives and indifferent to the harms that they inflict. Yet we don't have to accept that markets go unregulated and that wealth disparity goes unchecked. We can engage policymakers to change laws and practices. We can require reduced interest rates, more accessible banking services, protect our savings. We could require that financial advisors have a fiduciary obligation, in other words, an obligation to act in their clients' best interests. And we can halt the speculative profit made on many of these structured financial products, and it's made, frankly, on the backs of the hopes and dreams of most of us. Jointly, we can build and share our strength, find our common aspirations, collectively engage our bodies and minds in pressing for economic security, moving together to develop new possibilities for a financial system that's supportive of individuals and society as a whole. On Fairness, which you're about to hear, for flute, violin, and cello, was created by Peter Wall Institute composer-in-residence Alfredo Santa Anna. And it was inspired by perception in music and how different notions of fairness play a role in defining the rich interactivity between the listener and the music object. The 6 discrete movements, and you'll see them as it's performed, can actually be mixed in various orders. And the piece itself was created for an exploratory workshop on fairness that was held in January at the Peter Wall Institute. Tonight, it is uniquely performed by Karen Gerbeck, Olivia Blander, and Mark McGregor. And of course, the dance is performed by internationally acclaimed choreographer and dancer Marky Gillis, who observes that the body and spirit in the dance can energize and uncover hidden aspects of self, community, modeling healthy engagement, facilitating solution. We invite you to watch, to listen, to experience, and to reflect on fairness. Thank you.
First of all, my name's Kelty. First of all, thank you very much to all of you. It's funny that you mentioned Spain, because one of the most inspiring responses to the global financial crisis that I've seen was a YouTube video of a bunch of very high-level flamenco dancers in Spain storming a bank and having a great big flamenco party in the middle of it, in the middle of a workday. And they were singing about financial unfairness for the everyday person. So I'm wondering what kind of spaces you see this performance moving to, and if you're going to take it to the streets.
Would be interesting to do it in a bank. I'd want running shoes.
No, it's a really good point. I saw the video too, and I found it very empowering. Music empowers, and whenever we put ourselves in the mindset of listening, we're, I think, in the mindset of receiving. So whenever we hear a flute or a violin or a cello, we're also activating a history of those instruments and a history of our own memory with those instruments. So the way that we use these instruments and these musics to represent different aspects of our existence, I think we empower ourselves as a society, and I find it the only thing that I can do creatively speaking. That's why it's so important to me to be able to express that.
Hi, I'm Marnie. I'm a student at UBC, so thank you, Peter Wall Institute, for being so inspiring. My question or comment is just to touch on, perhaps, it occurs to me that people who would really benefit from this performance are, in fact, the decision makers, who perhaps caught in their cost-benefit logic are just, they can't compute affect, they're just totally separated from that. So how could you extend your performance to people who are in actually the seat of power, per se? Thanks.
We have had some people at the dance in Montreal. We've had some people at the dance in Montreal who have influences in those areas, or come from those areas, finding meaning through this and finding encouragement for change.
We actually had an extraordinary moment. So we first did it in April. We didn't have the musicians, unfortunately, but we did it in April in two venues in Montreal. One was in a beautiful chapel, but the other was in a very big open space where there were just hundreds of people with their children. And that was quite wonderful. But in the one in the chapel, a lawyer, an accountant, she was both, came down to us afterwards. Actually, Margie pulled her out of the audience. She asked a question and about, you know, how does one actually conceptualize these issues if you're working with scholars or other people, and Margie pulled her out of the audience to demonstrate. And she said to us afterwards that she organizes a huge conference of accountants every year, and she thought she would try and get us down. So I think there are some opportunities for those interactions, and I'd be excited to do them, of course. But I do think that my biggest interest is sort of a broad-based community dialogue. I think that's really, I'd like to see some groundswell of discussion about, you know, what it is we might agree on that we could push for in terms of basic change to laws, like having financial advisors act in our best interests.
So your comments just really are going in a direction I was interested in pursuing, which is to ask, and Mark, you addressed this a little bit earlier, how actually performing this and sharing the information you shared, Janice, in such an accessible way. I've never understood all those things, and I almost felt I understood them when I was listening to you. How the performance and the whole production of this has changed you, or your thinking about fairness. And I guess a companion question is things that have surprised you from audiences, or how it's changed others' perceptions of fairness. So any comments any of you have about that?
Should we start this way? You start.
I'm starting. For me, well, part of learning the piece was a very unique experience, and having to, we have, as classical musicians, so much of what we do is sort of dictated by sort of an Austro-Germanic tradition, and it follows a very specific pattern. This idea of, actually, a lot of feminist theorists refer to it as the climax form. And so it follows. It's very linear, and it follows a very specific path towards about 2/3 of the way. The piece is a gigantic explosion, and then there's sort of catharsis after that. So. As a musician who performs a lot of contemporary music and the music of our times, I found that it was very interesting to be confronted with a piece that completely comes out of left field in terms of how one approaches it formally. And when you play a piece, you have a big picture idea of it before you play. And for this piece, it's impossible to do because the form is constantly changing. And it's been very rewarding for me and very challenging to be able to play this piece, and a lot of Alfredo's music, because he does readdress aspects of form very much in a lot of his music. So for me, that's been very rewarding to do. And having Margie dance sort of brings, for us, all three of us as musicians, brought the whole thing up to another level of narrative. It was very... all these ideas that we had about the piece, all of a sudden, were transformed or heightened by seeing it through her eyes. It was so.
Thanks. Specifically to how I've changed, I think practically I've changed a lot of my mentality around distribution of musical material in compositions, which is very technical. But when I started writing the piece, I thought, well, fairness, I'll just make everybody, each one count the notes and make sure everybody's got 14 notes, but it didn't work. It ended up sounding very horribly. And so I thought it's relational, and it's about exchanging perspectives, and I think Janice spoke to it at the beginning before the piece was, and I really appreciated that definition, because it really sunk down to me in my practice that it doesn't mean that I have to give the violin all the solos, or that everybody has to have their equal share. It's everybody having access, and access means different things, but it's just giving voice to each of the instruments and making sure that there are moments that, the flute never played on its own. The cello did, and the violin did, but the flute also had passages that were, I think, more virtuosic than any of the other two instruments. So there's just different features that tend to come out, and I think as much as I tried to control those things before, I felt very comfortable in writing this piece because I sort of I loosened up a little bit. So I think that's my takeaway, that I can't control everything in music. I can't control the way that you received it or the way that it made an impression on you, but I can control perhaps the method of, moving around the form, distributing the material as best as I think the musicians will be able to treat it and have equal access and representation in the music.
I was really, really surprised at how excited and engaged the communities had gotten about their own activity. I mean, New York, everybody was really riled up in the audience. It started getting really rowdy. In fact, the audience was not sitting down, they were coming down. And we were starting to move and starting to dialogue about this and that and the other thing. And everybody felt they had a personal, there was a sort of a sense like, I can do something small, I can phone a friend, I can do this, I can do, just that there was real sense of activity around that. And that was really exciting for me to see that there was a sense of, yeah, I can do something. I don't know what it is even yet, but I can do something. So that personal initiative and feeling about that. For me, in the exploration, the adaptability when the musicians are there, how they play so differently, and a note will suddenly have to stretch or have to truncate, or be tucked under, and so I'm following and riding. I've got certain shapes, but I'm also following and riding the notes, the construction, but how they're playing it. So I'm lending myself to. At times there's almost a swoon for me. There certainly was in the last section. I was just, whoa, where is she going with that cello? Isn't it? Whoa. It was very sort of discovery-oriented, which was really nice, and I felt that was part of the solution, because I find that for me, it just seems like the the linear structure gets a little rigid, and the trying to figure it out turns into trying to figure it out. But when there is an organicness about it, or a cyclical sense of it, or a circle sense of it, then it comes more into like, okay, well, it will change. And how can it change? And so there's more of a sense of like, now I'm on the bottom, now I'm on the top, now I'm on the side, now I'm around to the front. Now that there's a better sense of shift, and even though I may have less or I may have more, it feels like there's a cycle in it, that all things can, I have more flexibility to take more different roles within that. So that was a big thing for me in terms of my relationship for fairness.
So there are probably a lot of responses to it, but I think from the project as a whole, how it's affected me is that I probably would rarely do a project again without bringing in a whole range of disciplines. When we started, we all spoke English, but we all spoke different language. You can imagine philosophers and cognitive neuroscientists and political scientists and business people, and it was quite extraordinary to start the conversation. And so what we did was we actually did a day with Margie and Michelle LeBaron, and they made us stop talking and start moving conceptions of fairness. And for a bunch of people who sort of live from here up, it was really interesting. And so when you think about sort of in financial markets, when you think about sort of these huge institutions and big governments, and frankly, part of the issue is, of course, that the people who are influencing the decision makers are not us. They're actually quite powerful economic interests. And so I just want to even out that dialogue. And so when you think about these immovable things, the fact that we did movement to try and talk about how one finds the spaces to make a difference was quite fundamental. And I think the notion of arts as a methodology of research, or arts as a way to change the lens and help you refocus at a moment when you think you've hit a roadblock about trying to develop policy or develop community dialogue. So that's, I think, fundamentally changed how I approach things now.
Participant in the audience, I could plug in different places, and I didn't necessarily need to understand the whole, but there were parts of it that I could relate to, and the wild sort of rolling nature of it, because it's kind of like that it makes it safer to interject in something that I really don't know a whole lot about. As an Indigenous woman, I'm really looking at how does finance and fairness, lead with the whole socioeconomic status of Aboriginal people within this country, and moving from a place of health and starting to look at a place of business and finance and all of those things with great trepidation, and but sort of a fundamental belief that there's got to be a way that we can create better equity for our people in this country if we explore this in a way that's meaningful to us culturally. So for me, this was a really important evening in terms of creating that opportunity for building resilience and to really start engaging in some discussion that I don't know a whole lot about, but I'm excited. I learned more here tonight than I have in a really long time, just from the short pamphlets and all of that. And so I really appreciate the work that you've done today, and I know it certainly made a difference to me. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katrine. I loved it. It was beautiful. I love the chair, the little chair. And I just was able to superimpose on that little chair my own story. I found it so poetic, and so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the chair and how it came, the little chair and how it came to be. Thank you.
I don't remember. It just seemed like it needed to be there. It was what wasn't in the room. So it was who wasn't there. And I was sort of pondering that because I kept configuring the chairs and moving the chairs around. The chairs excluded, the chairs included, the chairs excluded, the chairs confronted, the chairs, they piled up, they fell apart, they all, what wasn't, and then suddenly went, just wait a minute, what's not in these chairs. Who's not in these chairs? Also, the musicians weren't in the chairs when I started mucking with them, and Little became very important. And Little is actually a chair that was made by my great-grandfather. Yeah, so Little was hanging out in the house and just sort of going off to rehearsal again, are you? You know, and finally, you know, so, oh, hey, you want to come? And Little came.
There was one up here.
Yeah, my name is Michael. My question is going back to the format of this process. I found my own experience was I did kind of glaze over during your opening talk. It was, you know, words that are not familiar with me, to the extent where I felt almost obligated to be going back to thinking about your talk during the performance. And I think that was particularly effective, but that does, you know, it almost pedestaled the dialogue element of this project, which I think is probably the point. But did you experiment at all with integrating the speech, like the talking during that?
You are so smart. You are so smart. That could happen. That may happen. That may happen. We will need a few rehearsals. We will need a director. Or no. That's great.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. It's something that I think happens a lot in music sometimes through program notes and through brochures, and people come in and they're handed sort of like all this information, which is very valuable for sure. But you're right, it also frames the experience for them in a kind of way. So I think it would be great to experiment with just, you know, even public space and all of a sudden having it and then trying to engage in dialogue. It might be a little bit more difficult, and the lighting and everything, it's kind of hard to do all together at the same time, but yeah.
But just to echo that, in terms of a hierarchy of knowledge and fairness, we have prioritized verbal linear knowledge, and it is time that the senses and the sensual and the music and the art and the aesthetic and dance become part of the dialogue and foremost, because that is actually what has been missing. Okay.
Thank you.
I find it so interesting because from my perspective, I was just the opening act. You know, I was just trying to frame it, but I just really wanted to get to the dance. So it's an interesting perception. The other thing is, and I just want to come back to your comment, because I've struggled with this, and you know, all that sort of information in the pamphlet. I actually spent a fair bit of time because I don't believe in dumbing down things, but I also want to make it accessible, and it's actually a hard one when it talks about structured financial products. And so I was, you know, I mean, I have a vocabulary, and I talk a language with most of the people that I interact with in law and banking and finance. And so I was trying to find a midpoint, and I think it's an ongoing process about what, you know, I was trying to use the words so people don't feel afraid of them, but then try to explain them. And it is a lot of information, but a lot of what I said is in the loot bag, the loot brochure that you get to take home. So hopefully you can think about it and some more, but it's a very interesting observation.
Hi. My name is Madeline. I have so much, my head is everywhere with this because it's kind of in the dialogue, everything's starting to come together and make sense for me. I think when I first came, I didn't know this was happening, and I came with my mom Yvonne, and I had no idea what I was coming to. And when I saw the pamphlet outside and everyone was grabbing it, I grabbed it, and I kind of looked at it, and I just threw it back to her. And I was like, I don't know what this is. And I'll just go inside because she told me how amazing Margie Gillis was at dancing. So I was like, okay, I'll come and see this. But I threw the pamphlet back at her, and I was like, I don't know what this is, so you read it. And I think what I'm trying to say is that I came because of the dance piece, just very much as, but I think everything we do, and I think this comes down to what you said, dumbing things down, is that even the commercials, like, that's art. Everything's art, you know, the way everything's delivered to us, the way people speak about, you know, the economics, it's all an art. It's like, how are we going to deliver this to people in the community that they're going to believe this, right? Like, everything's an art, but how do you think, because for me, when you read that in the beginning, it started not making sense for me when you were reading everything. It started becoming a lot of like, oh, I don't understand what she's really talking about. I don't understand the language of it. And I think, I'm not sure. And then when the dance came out, I was like, okay, yeah, the dialogue of that to the dance started to make a little more sense. And now when we're talking about it, it's making even more sense. But how do you think the younger people, or, you know, teenagers, or in the early 20s, late 20s, you know, like around that graphic, how have they, from your experience, connected with this piece to be able, you know, like from the understanding? Because I think young people could really benefit from this, because I've learned a lot just from all the separate pieces, but everything coming together now.
One of the 3 New York performances were almost all young people. And what was interesting to me is they were some of the ones very animated, and they were very savvy. And I think the advantage is they spent a lot of time in front of the computer, and they get a lot of access to a lot of information that they had a lot of questions and a lot of reflections on. So it was quite an extraordinary night, I would say. It was the most animated dialogue I've seen in years, I think. So there's potential there.
One of the things that we did during the question is they would come up with questions, and then we would model it physically a bit. So they would go, what about this? This is a problem I have with getting through to this this idea or this notion around finances. We'd just sort of make up a little, you know, thingy-bob about it physically. Or somebody would come up with a question. Well, what about the fact that I feel they're running away from me? And then so we'd have somebody run away from them, and then find out how to work that out physically. And somehow, by working it out physically, they had a lot of aha moments about like, oh yeah, it seems real to me now. And everybody kind of got excited in that way, too. That was kind of cool. But it is so accessible, isn't it? I mean, there it is. It just suddenly starts to tease out and make sense, and you can do something.
Last question?
Thank you so much. My name's Patty DeSante, and I really bow to your discipline practice. Thank you. And the conversation for me, really, this gentleman over here with the diversity, that's really a critical issue for me. I work with street kids, I work with youth around the world, and I work with hip hop. And particularly what's a form of indigenous hip-hop, where they're utilizing their own language. So what I would love to see, this is an invitation, comes from sort of integrating this young man here also. I would love, if you guys are interested, to almost have a translation of what you're saying in terms of real street, urban, indigenous hip-hop. So that, yeah, I agree, this integration of the language with the movement and the, you know, the real energetics can even come in different forms, and I think the conversation would expand, because that little chair is a representation of all the kids that I work with. And what we have here is a lot of people who are amazing at what they do, but it's almost the language of the people who actually inhabit the mindset that has created our issues. So how do we integrate that with the music and also the language? So as this young woman was saying here, I need it translated. And I tell you, I've got some amazing hip-hop artists.
You got some good translators.
Yeah, some great translators who'll translate what you're saying, and that can even move in. So it's an invitation. You and I know each other from Bowen.
I can't see you, but
it's Patty. It's Katie DeSante's mom.
Oh, okay.
Oh. So I am.
We all know
always
each other
that sort
as
of
mothers.
Shit disturber, positive instigator. But I invite you to have a further conversation.
Okay.
I'll bring some of those folks in if you want. And thank you so much. Mm-hmm.
That would be amazing to have them dancing the rhythm of the words.
Yeah.
As she speaks.
Mm-hmm.
To shift
Like
that,
something to get that rhythm.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Great idea.
Anyways, so I invite that.
So let me just end by thanking the musicians, Mark and your colleagues. Alfredo for this amazing creation that I know will have a life far beyond tonight. And Margie, we've actually been, in 3 cities now doing this, and it's been an extraordinary journey, and it gets more beautiful and more poignant all the time. And so thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I want to thank all of you because one of the things that the Institute's interested in is sort of doing things that are slightly riskier, slightly different. And so all of these kinds of initiatives are trying to help us learn as scholars, and I don't mean just myself, but many, many scholars out at UBC and other places about how we can give to the community, but also partner with the community and sort of bring dialogue forward and issues forward. So thank you to all of you for participating. We deeply appreciate it. Thank you.